Naked Snake Press in collaboration with Horror Girls Nightmare Emporium presents What are some dark family secrets you learned of once you were old enough? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the community page to learn how to submit your true tales of terror or your own short original fiction. Cheers and enjoy.
Rated NSFW, not safe for work. My father was married to another woman before meeting my mother. They had a daughter and my dad loved her so much that his wife started going crazy jealous. My dad noticed some strange behavior she had towards the girl, and when he tried to talk to her about it, she started arguing with him. He then left with his daughter to my uncle's house. She knew my dad would leave the girl with my aunt while he was at work, so she called the police and said my aunt kidnapped her child. The police came in and took the girl away from my aunt. She immediately tried to call my dad, but the woman drove back home, put poison in her daughter's milk, and forced her to drink it. When my dad arrived, he found his daughter already dead and left alone. The woman was never ever found. My dad had never had justice for his first child. Kinda sad. Then when I was born, my mother didn't mind to name me after my sister. We share the same name, and that's actually how I found it out. I asked my parents about my name and they told me the whole story. When I was around 3 to 4, my aunt and her 3 sons came and lived with us for a few weeks. One night my mom stayed up and I found her downstairs sitting in a chair looking out the window. One day my aunt and the boys moved and never came back. Turns out, she was going through a nasty divorce. She had the boys at the house with her while she was packing things one day, and her husband came home. He locked the boys in a room, stabbed her, and then shot himself. My mom had been staying up with a gun that night because she had seen him in our backyard earlier that night. I was told that my mother's older brother had died in an accident. He was intoxicated and got run over by a train, a whole bunch of unfortunate circumstances, etc. My grandmother often mentioned it with sadness because she considered him a brilliant boy, very handy, and who had a hopeful career in arts. He was a teenager when he died. However, every time this story came up, my mother's face hardened and she never spoke about it herself. I could kinda sense that there was something left unsaid, but I was a kid, so I didn't really question the story. My mom finally confided in me about a year ago that she was sexually abused by her brother and that it was not an accident, but a suicide. My grandmother has no idea. My paternal grandfather was an alcoholic wife abuser who regularly cheated on grandma. When my father was a teenager, he stood up to him and threatened to kill him if he ever touched her again. My grandparents ran a boys' home in the 60s and 70s for kids with unsafe living situations, abusive families, juvenile criminal records, etc. It was well run, and they provided the kids with a good life. My mom was an only child and grew up living around them. When I was small and asked her about it, she would say that for the larger part she loved growing up around them because it was like having friends all the time. In the pictures that exist of her from that time, she looks like a little boy herself. She refused to wear girls' clothes and had a boy's haircut. But in all of these photos of her, throughout her childhood and adolescence, there is a strange sad energy in her face that I couldn't put my finger on even though she is smiling. I could just feel it when I saw those pictures. I didn't understand how she would describe these times as so fun and happy, but when my grandma would say she had heard from one of the boys around Christmas, Easter, or birthdays, my mom would go quiet and look close to tears and maybe stay this way for a day or so. My mom was an extremely overprotective mother when I was a teen. At 14, I wasn't allowed to shave my legs, pluck my eyebrows, or wear anything that wasn't a learner bra. Nothing terrible, but it felt like I was being kept as a child. At 15, I rebelled a bit and my mom clamped down even harder. She would emphasize over and over that boys were not to be trusted. They only want one thing: girls that give off certain messages to them will come a cropper. The horrible twist is that I was assaulted by men on 2 separate occasions in my teens, and when I told her, she basically said to me, "I told you so." I went through therapy a bit later and managed to process that these things weren't my fault and that my mother's logic had made things worse. I confronted her with this: those events were not my fault. It was nobody's fault but the perpetrators. I did not do anything that invited assault. She really could not accept this. It had to be my fault in some way. When I went to the police to make a historical report, she was extremely awkward and unsupportive. My dad stepped in to help me during this time. 2 years later, during an argument, my mom tells me that she was molested, groomed, and assaulted from the age of 6 by 2 separate boys in their early adolescence who were living at the home. She didn't realize anything about this was wrong until her father saw something happening to her, blamed her, implied she caused it to happen, told her mother, and said it must not happen again. My mom was 8. Nothing happened to the boys, who had likely been sexually abused themselves. The home carried on working for years and no one said anything more about it. When my mom told me this, I just held her and told her it wasn't her fault, that her parents should have protected her when they knew that was happening, and that she should have been better cared for. When she told me, I felt no shock. It felt like I had always known. The sad feeling I could see in those pictures of my mom when she was little, and how she had so desperately tried to protect me from growing up, suddenly all made sense. Grandpa died while snorting coke and getting head in his Corvette. Got a Facebook message from one guy asking if I was related to my dad, since it's not a common last name. I thought he was a fan of his work because I was in college at the time and the guy was about the same age as me. And that's how I found out my dad slept around and that I had a half-brother the same age as me. My mild-mannered Christian mother casually told me that she dated a gangster who trafficked cocaine in NY during the 80s. He bought her a brand new BMW before getting sentenced to prison for murder for 20+ years. Someone who was friends with her and her ex for years turned out to be an FBI informant, and she barely escaped jail, had to enter a witness protection program, and moved cross-country. Here's the craziest part, he's still stalking her, has contacted her on her birthday every year for 40 years, and keeps tabs on her. My dad has no idea. I asked her why she waited so long to tell me. Like, what if she went missing? And she said, "Oh honey, he's the type of person that if he wanted to harm me, I would already be dead by now." Very comforting. A cousin of mine's dad blew his own head off in the horse stall next to him while they were cleaning them. I was told about that at around 15 because I was going to spend some time with them and was told not to mention their father. My grandpa was alcohol addicted and the biggest asshole. He was a terrible father and husband. He beat my mom and my 2 uncles and my grandma, had them terrified every time he came home from drinking somewhere, and had them hiding for hours under their bed until he finally passed out. My grandma had cancer and almost died when she was like 40. My mom had to take care of her all by herself, and she visited her in the hospital, which was like an hour away. All she ever heard from her dad, my grandpa, was that he hopes that the bitch just finally died. My mom was 17 at that time and also had to accomplish her apprenticeship at the same time. Most of the people in the city we lived in knew who my grandpa was because he had some job that was somewhat important. Everyone always just recognized by my last name that he has to be my grandpa, and they all always talked about how much they liked him and how happy I have to be to have a grandpa like him and blah, blah. People knew nothing about him. My grandfather killed his youngest brother to get out of going to Vietnam. He, his brother, and 2 of their friends had their numbers called in the draft for Vietnam. They didn't want to go, obviously, but they didn't come from money and all worked to support their families. If they got arrested, they'd lose their jobs and their families would lose their income. So they decided on a different plan to get out of going. They would drive to get their medical checks together, and on the way there they would drive the car into a tree. The plan was to get too injured to get sent to war, but not so injured as to be permanently crippled, and it had to look like an accident so nobody got arrested. This was in country Western Australia, so they were all going to say they swerved to miss a kangaroo and hit the tree. My grandfather was driving, his friend was in the passenger seat, and the other 2 were in the back. His brother was behind the passenger seat. They hit the tree doing about 40 kilometers per hour, enough to be serious. A broken leg for my grandfather, a broken arm for the guy behind him, and broken ribs all around. They definitely weren't going to war. The problem was that for maximum impact, and because this was rural Australia in the 60s, they weren't wearing seatbelts. And nobody found them or their car for an hour or so. And nobody considered internal injuries in this plan. And my grandfather's brother bled to death from a ruptured spleen in the back seat. He was dead before they got to a hospital. My grandfather never forgave himself, and he never talked about it. As far as we know, my grandma was the only one he ever told, and she didn't tell my mother and me until long after his death. We found a small box in their bedroom when we were cleaning out the house after she died last year. It had a clipping from the local newspaper at the time about the accident. It said that they had swerved to Missouri and called it a tragedy. I don't think my mother told any of her siblings, so technically this is still the family secret. I guess now you're all in on it. My grandmother was in a very abusive relationship since she was 17. Since her then boyfriend was an alcoholic and forced himself drunk on my grandmother several times, she got pregnant, and since that was not done in the 50s, they had to get married as soon as possible. After their first child, they ended up having 4 more kids. One didn't survive childbirth, but the other 3 lived. During this time, my grandmother's husband was still an alcoholic and very, very abusive. She had to literally flee from him, from her family, to survive. She would definitely end up dead if she didn't. She also met my grandfather during this time, and they fell in love. She left her kids with her mother, who had custody of the kids anyway. That's how they rolled back then. My grandfather sold the only thing he had, which was a small moped, so he could help her escape her husband. Many years later, when my grandma had divorced her husband, married my grandpa, had 3 more kids with him, grandkids, etc., yay me, and moved back to the hometown, they also reconnected with her first 4 daughters, and everything was going well, except for one thing. It was a tiny town, everybody knows everybody over there, and rumors spread fast. And there was a rumor about my grandmother from back in the days of her first husband. The rumor was that she had some sort of fling with another man in town, not my grandpa, and one of her first 4 daughters was his. The daughters didn't know about this until they heard, asked my grandma about it, and she was flabbergasted. Told them it wasn't true at all, that it definitely didn't happen, and that this should be the end of it. It didn't sit right with the daughters, so they did a DNA test. And then the results came in. There it was, proof that the gossip wasn't actually gossip, but it was true. Daughter number 3 was a half-sister of the other 3. So they went to my grandmother again. They showed her the proof. It said very clearly that one of them wasn't their father's. My grandma denied again, even though they had it black on white that it was true. The daughters went no contact with my grandmother after this. They never got over the fact that she left them in the first place, and this betrayal was the straw that broke the camel's back. Can't really blame them for that. Still, to this day, she claims it didn't happen and that all 4 women are from the same man. Apparently, my aunt was the product of rape, but my grandma hasn't told anyone in the family yet except me. She just turned 90. I have no idea what I should do with this information once she passes. My father met my mother in the Philippines when he was stationed there in the Navy. He married her there and conceived me. He went away to finish his tour of duty. My mother moved to America when she was a month away from giving birth to me. She moved in with relatives in Texas. My father's tour ended while he was in Hawaii. He met a woman there and called my mom in America, asking for a divorce. He wanted to take back his recent marriage to her with a kid on the way, because he had a hot one-night stand. My mother was already scared, being in a new country, not knowing much English. Add to this that she was pregnant, about to give birth, and her husband was dumping her. My Texan uncle got on a plane to Hawaii, prepared to kick my father's ass. He somehow talked my father into being a man and taking responsibility for his wife and child. The fact that the fling dumped his ass surely helped. He was back by the time I was born. I learned all this when I was 11, around the time my parents got divorced. It was only the first of countless dark family secrets I would come to learn during my teenage years. Not very much a secret, but took me until I was older to understand what was happening. My mom would sometimes have us play a game called Army, which consisted of me, my mom, and my siblings army crawling around our apartment. Kind of a hide-and-seek style game. She would yell, "Hit the deck," randomly, and we would all drop and find a hiding spot. We would giggle and giggle while my mom's army crawled around looking for us. We loved the game so much. I realized a few years ago while retelling the story that we lived in a really terrible neighborhood, and she would yell it out when she heard gunshots outside the building. I'm assuming she was worried about stray bullets. Edit, I shared everyone's amazing comments with my mom, and she shed a tear. She feels very appreciated on International Women's Day today. My grandmother tried to murder my grandfather when she got sick of him beating the shit out of her every day. She swung an axe at him and he blocked it with his hand and lost his thumb. She left him before I was born. That schizophrenia ran in my mom's side of the family. I developed it a year after she told me about it at 25. She didn't refer to it as schizophrenia but as her maiden name, madness. She said that every once in a while someone in our family would go mad and that's what they would call it. I guess her side of the family also had ties to organized crime, and at least one of them was a prostitute. My family never talked about issues or emotions, so it was a shock. I assumed our ancestors were relatively normal, but I also thought my family was sane back then too. Mine is cooler than horrifying in the sense I'm proud of this one. My grandfather was an amazing guy. He was a sniper paratrooper in World War II. Always refused to talk about the army. I learned later that he was dishonorably discharged after injury. Turns out the sergeant in his squad was an absolute bastard. He had to go behind enemy lines to set a post up, and the plane was flying too low for a safe jump. He protested it to the sergeant, who shoved him out of the plane after calling him a coward. Both my grandfather and his spotter partner were seriously injured in the landing. His partner, who never knew him, was paralyzed and lost a leg. My grandfather broke both of his arm, hand, and some ribs. They both were rescued shortly after and taken to a military hospital. That's not what got him discharged, though. Turns out the sergeant showed up to visit them in the infirmary, and my grandfather punched him square in the face with his only good hand, twice. If his only army buddy we ever knew is to be believed, he was also visiting at the time, he floored the bastard. After that, and on top of his injuries, the army sent him home for the rest of the war. We found out later after he passed, and we had to go through his stuff, a bunch of newspaper and article clippings about the folks involved he had kept. The sergeant was also discharged after a similar incident cost the lives of 2 other squad members a year later, who weren't so lucky. The man apparently drank himself to death years later. We found all these written but unsent letters to his sergeant. We found photos of my grandfather's squad and the 2 that died with him. It was heartbreaking. I never knew any of this. He was such a fun, kind, and goofy guy you'd never think anything like this would happen to him. Now I knew why my parents always said never to bring up the army around him. Miss you, Grandpa. I'd have punched the bastard too. My mom had a brother who died in childhood, maybe 9 or 10. I always thought he drank cleaning chemicals and died that way, but turns out he was hit by a school bus while riding his bike. Now I know why my mom was so anxious about me biking on the road. My father cheated on my mom, my sister, and my horse riding instructor. We'd always thought it ended amicably. We only found this out while Mom was admitting to having contemplated driving off the road with us in the car as kids, as opposed to raising us as a single mom with no career or stable job. Edit, added a comma to prevent hilarious confusion. When I was about 10, my cousin and his dad died. I always thought it was an accident, and on the same day. When I was old enough, I was told that his dad actually committed suicide, and my cousin followed him a couple of months later. Truly devastated me, although I didn't know them well. Edit, thank you for the warm words and also for sharing your similar stories with me. I've read all the replies. My grief is still there because I understand that with professional help both would maybe still be here today. It just wasn't common to seek help back then. I hope all of you are well. A great uncle was taken from his parents, told he was retarded, wouldn't be right, put in state hospitals, and experimented upon. The only thing wrong with him was a speech impediment. When I was young, I thought it was really nice that my Nana lived with my aunt and her family since she was getting on a bit, and it meant she was looked after, and there were always people around. Aunt has 6 kids. Occasionally Aunt would gripe about being the one looking after Nana since Aunt is also one of many kids, and being young I sympathized, but given they all spent loads of time with Nana too, didn't think it was a big deal. You don't think about financial responsibility when you're young, I think, just social and caring. Well, it turns out the reason Nana lives with my aunt is that my aunt and her husband persuaded Nana to put the house in their name so they could look after her affairs, and sold it out from under her and invested the money in a pyramid scheme. So it's gone now. Because of this, her siblings refuse to give my aunt a penny for looking after Nana since it's her fault Nana has no money or assets, and instead pay to take Nana out all the time, meals, shopping, and activities so she doesn't go without, but they let Aunt struggle under the weight of Nana's general living expenses. Aunt's kids are all independent now, so they are not going to be impacted by money problems. Now I look back at her griping with annoyance and think she is a terrible person. My uncle, my father's brother, used to hit my aunt, and when my mother found out, in the middle of a wedding party, she went straight to beat his ass. People had to break up the fight. I found out because my parents were talking about it as if it were nothing. I was mortified. If I had known what a piece of shit my uncle was, I would have never treated him well like I did all my life. The worst part is that they're still together. The good part is that I'm proud of my mom. That my cousin was actually my half-brother. Mom got pregnant in college and my aunt and uncle adopted him. And that my dad wasn't my biological father. Mom and dad got divorced, she got pregnant by another man, and my dad wasn't able to have kids of his own, so they got remarried and he raised me as his own. Not so much let on as we found out by accident, but apparently, my dad's first love, and he got into a serious car crash when he was 25 and she died. He lived with her father for years after her death. He still occasionally comes to visit my dad, even 30 years later. We were always told he was a mentor until my sister pressed my mom on the subject. One of my sisters is even named after the girl that died, middle name, we never even knew about her until last year. None of us have ever brought it up with him. I was in my senior year of high school when my grandparents told me about the family tragedy. My grandfather's brother murdered his wife. She was trying to divorce him and he snapped. He went to jail and their son, my dad's cousin, was alone. He was in middle/high school. My grandparents convinced the deceased mother's side of the family to let them finish raising him and were able to get him back on a good path after the trauma he suffered. He has grown up into an absolutely wonderful man with a wonderful family, and I love him. Maybe not as dark as some other stories around here, but it still weighs heavy on my family. My dad had a little sister and she got run over by a car right in front of him when they were on their way to school. She was only 10 years old and my dad was around 12. I only found out about it because I got diagnosed with depression and my mom told the doctor that there is a family history of depression. I was underage at the time of the diagnosis, and it's my dad who has depression, probably because of the accident. My grandparents moved right next to the cemetery where she is buried. I recently found out you can look at her grave from their kitchen window.
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And feel free to leave a comment or email the Horror Girls with suggestions, your own scary experience, original fiction, disconcerting videos, or anything horror related that you would like to share. We'd also love to help promote indie or up-and-coming horror authors by posting a book review or your book trailer. Email us for more info.